Hey everyone, it's Heather Nichols, and today I'm sharing this set of cards that I created with my new Planting Happiness stamp set. They're perfect for Mother's Day and more. Here's a look at the Planting Happiness stamp set. There's all sorts of flowers and leaves and stems, so you can create whatever floral arrangement that you'd like. I'll also use the coordinating dies. I'll be using the inside scalloped Stacklets die collection along with the stitched rectangle Stacklets die collection, and I'll be using the linen background stamp. I'm doing embossing on my project, and so I have VersaMark ink, white embossing powder, and my anti-static powder tool. I'm doing watercolor with the Korean BrushmarkerPRO markers. I'll share the color names that I use in detail in the video, and then I also have a water brush and a container of water. I'll be doing my watercoloring on the 111-pound watercolor cardstock. That is what we recommend to use with the Korean BrushmarkerPRO markers. For ink, I'll be using chocolate truffle and toffee. I'm using bits and pieces clear drip drops, and then for adhesives, I'll be using multi-medium matte and foam squares. So let's get started. One side of the watercolor cardstock is smoother than the other, so choose the smoother side, and that is the side that I recommend stamping on. I'm conditioning my cardstock with my anti-static powder tool, and I'll be stamping the floral images from the set using VersaMark ink. I'll ink up the stamps in my MISTI and then close the lid of the MISTI to stamp the images onto the watercolor cardstock. You might want to do more than one impression with the ink to ensure that you have good coverage. Once the image is stamped, you can pour the white embossing powder over the stamped images. You could also use clear embossing powder for the watercoloring technique I'm going to share. I've got a piece of paper underneath my work area so that it will catch the excess embossing powder that I tap off of the image, and then I can actually put that back in the container. And then I'll use a heat tool to melt the embossing powder on the images until it is shiny. Okay, now it's time to color the images, and I'm going to be using the Korean BrushmarkerPROs. I've got those ready to go, and here is a close-up look at the colors I used for this project. For greens, I'm using lime green and olive green. For yellows, I'm using gold, and I'll be shading that with amber. For pinks, I'll be doing pale pink and shading that with fire red. For browns, I'll be using praline and shading that with cocoa. Wherever the images are embossed, that will resist the watercolor. And I love watercoloring embossed images. The raised embossed lines keep the paint contained where I want it to be on the image, and it just gives me better control over where my color is going. I'm using a wet on wet technique to do my watercoloring, which means I am using a wet brush to paint in the area that I'm going to add color. I'm painting in the area with clean, clear water. Then I'm just touching the marker to the edge of the petal, for example, on this flower, and then I'll use my brush to pull that color down the rest of the shape. I want the darker colors to be kind of towards the center of the flowers, and then it lightens up as it goes to the end. So again, I'm adding water to where I'm going to add my color. I'm touching the marker to the one side of the petal, and then I'm using my brush to pull that color across. While everything is still wet, I'll add the darker color that I'm going to use to shade. So for example, I'm using the yellow for the petal, and then I'm using that orange to add a little bit of shading, and I'm really just adding a small amount and then using my brush to spread that color down the petal. I'm going to keep repeating this process to color all of the parts of all of the flowers, and I'll just speed you through me coloring several of the images from the set. Once the images are all colored, I'll use the coordinating dies to cut them out. I'm just trimming the pieces apart so they'll fit through my Sidekick machine. I'll hold the dies in place with Scotch removable tape as I cut them out. Next, I'm creating a frame for my card using the stitched rectangle stacklets, and inside Scallop Stacklets die collections. I'm using the largest stitched rectangle stacklets die, and I went a size down from the largest for the inside Scallop dies. I'll arrange these to make the frame shape on my die cut machine, and then I'll just use some Scotch removable tape to hold the dies together so that they don't move and that the frame stays the shape that I want it to be. I'm die cutting the frames from Sugar Cube cardstock. My cards are going to be on Toffee card bases, and I wanted to add a background or some sort of texture to the Toffee cardstock, so I chose the linen background stamp. I'm setting this up in my MISTI, and then I'll stamp this linen background onto the front of the Toffee card base with Toffee ink. I'm adding a few splatters to my background. First, I'll use Copic Opaque white ink. I'll pick that up with a water brush and then tap the brush over my finger to add the splatters to the backgrounds. And then I'm also using chocolate truffle ink that's been pressed onto an acrylic block. Again, I'll just pick that color up with a water brush and tap it on my finger to splatter onto the background. Now that I have all the parts of my card, I want to play around with the layout so I can decide where the sentiment is going to go. And so I'm arranging the stems and leaves and flowers within the frame to see how that will look. I'm stamping the Happy Mother's Day sentiment from the set on my cards, and I'll set that where I want it to go, and then we'll transfer this over to my MISTI so we can stamp it on both of the card bases. I'll take off all of the extra pieces once my sentiment is where I want it to go, and then I'll make sure that the sentiment is straight on the lid of the MISTI, and I'll stamp that onto the card base with chocolate truffle ink. Okay, now it's time to put these cards together. I'm attaching the frames to the card base with multimedia matte, or you can use another sort of adhesive of your choice. Then I'm adding the stem images, and I'm adding them so the bottom of the stem is tucked into the bottom of the frame, and I'm adhering those directly to the card base. I'm adding the larger flowers to the stems with a foam adhesive square so that that pops up a little bit from the card front. And then the smaller flower at the bottom of the frame, I am gluing the leaf to the back of the flower, and then I'll pop those up onto the card and adhere them with foam squares. I'll finish adding the flowers to the second card, and then we are ready to embellish with some clear drip drops. I've got the clear drip drops arranged where I want them on the card, and I'm attaching them with multimedia matte. I'll use my Crystal Katana tool to help me place the gems, and then these cards are done. I love how these turned out, and I hope you enjoyed learning how to do the emboss resist technique with watercolor using the Corine BrushmarkerPRO markers. You can find the supplies that I used to create these cards in the Tailored Expressions web store at tailoredexpressions.com. Thanks so much for joining me, everybody, and I'll see you next time.